They called her too loud, too bold, too much. But what happens when the world finally realizes they needed her voice all along? Let us know in the comments section below where you're watching from today. They told Clarrisa Dupri to use her inside voice before she even understood what that meant. Kindergarten, first grade, second, always the same notes home. Clarrisa talks too much. Clarrisa interrupts. Clarrisa has trouble respecting silence. But no one asked why her voice was always the first thing to enter a room. They didn't care to know that she came from a house where silence meant danger, where silence meant not asking why Mama wasn't home again or why Daddy's chair at the dinner table stayed empty. Silence, to Clarrisa, was fear wrapped in politeness, and fear had no place in her bones. At 17, Clarrisa was a senior at Ashwood High School, the kind of place that wore its diversity on banners but flinched when it actually spoke. Clarrisa never flinched. Not when Mr. Briggs gave her that long stare before she even opened her mouth. Not when she was the only black girl in AP English. Not when classmates whispered, "There she goes again," as she challenged the curriculum. It wasn't about being right, it was about being seen. And in that classroom, in that school, in that town, she refused to disappear quietly. Mr. Briggs, on the other hand, believed in order, believed in decorum, believed every student had a place, and Clarrissa's was apparently smaller than most. He was a man who paused every time she raised her hand, like he had to decide if he had the strength to endure her voice. To him, she was a disruption, a clanging bell in a church that had grown used to a whisper. She didn't try to argue with him anymore, at least not verbally. Now she used her tone, her posture, her gaze. She would sit upright, bold, her hand in the air long before the question even finished falling from his lips. And when he'd glance at her and look away, choosing someone else instead, she didn't drop her arm. She let it stay up until her shoulder burned, until the whole class saw the refusal in her stillness. Kayla Rivers sat next to her, whispering under her breath, "Girl, you're gonna need rotator cuff surgery." Clarrisa smirked, but didn't look away from the front of the room. "Then let me go down swinging." Ashwood High had a mural near the entrance. It was all handprints and affirmations, words like unity, pride, and progress painted in neat block letters by students who believed in the illusion of belonging. Clarrisa had painted power in the bottom corner, in her own handwriting, just slightly crooked. 2 weeks later, someone painted over it with the word patience. That was Ashwood. Loved the energy, as long as it didn't ripple the surface. Clarrisa lived with her grandmother, Miss Evelyn Dupri, in a small lavender house 2 blocks from the school. It smelled like shea butter and old books, and in every room hung photos of women whose faces were framed in strength. Evelyn Dupri never told Clarrisa to quiet down. Instead, she told stories, long ones, stories of protest lines and segregated buses, stories where speaking up meant risking your job, your life, your place in the world, and she'd always end with the same soft, steady truth. "Baby, don't ever let them shame you for your voice. That's where your ancestors live." So when Mr. Briggs sent her to the principal's office for being combative after pointing out that a debate prompt about crime statistics ignored racial bias, Clarrisa walked the hallway like a runway. She wasn't ashamed. She was ready. Principal Saunders greeted her with a look she knew too well. A tired, exasperated kind of disappointment. She was a black woman too, but the kind who had survived by staying agreeable. Clarrisa didn't hate her for it, but she also didn't admire it. "Clarrisa," she began, hands folded like a prayer she wasn't brave enough to say out loud, "you have so much potential, but you need to learn when to speak and when to listen." Clarrisa tilted her head. "Was I wrong?" Principal Saunders hesitated. "That's not the point." "It always is." The silence stretched, uncomfortable, heavy. "Go back to class," Principal Saunders said at last. "Just try not to escalate." "Is the truth An escalation? Another silence. And that's when Clarrisa knew they weren't afraid of her being wrong. They were afraid of her being right, and loud enough for everyone else to hear it too. Back in class, Mr. Briggs didn't even acknowledge her return, just kept scribbling on the whiteboard as if the room hadn't shifted. But Clarrisa sat taller, firmer, her notebook open, her pen ready. Because one day she wasn't just going to be heard, she was going to be amplified. And when that day came, Mr. Briggs wouldn't even know what hit him. At lunch, the cafeteria buzzed like it always did, plastic trays clattering, sneakers squeaking against the linoleum, laughter bouncing from wall to wall. But at table 12, the noise fell flat around Clarrisa and Kayla like a bubble of friction. No one wanted to press too hard. "You know he's doing it on purpose, right?" Kayla snapped open her orange juice, the cap flying off and landing on someone else's tray. "He could call on anyone, but every time you speak, it's like his hearing gets selective." Clarrisa didn't answer right away. She pushed her grapes to the corner of her tray with one slow finger. "He's not scared of me. He's scared of the truth having a mouth that looks like mine." Kayla chewed that over in silence. "So, what now? You going to keep raising your hand until you dislocate something?" Clarrisa looked up, eyes burning in that same way her grandmas did when talking about her own marches and sit-ins. "Until he learns that me not raising my hand doesn't mean I'm not in the room." From a table nearby, a whisper cut through the noise like a razor. "There goes Clarrisa again. She thinks this is CNN." Clarrisa turned her head, slow and steady. Two girls, juniors maybe, stared at her with that half-smirk, half-garl thing that said, "We don't get you, and we don't want to." They looked away as soon as Clarrisa met their gaze. She didn't flinch. She wasn't raised to. Back home later that day, she dropped her backpack by the front door with a thud. Miss Evelyn was at the dining table, carefully folding old newspaper clippings, each one yellowed at the edges like forgotten pages in a sacred book. "You got that storm look on your face again," Evelyn said without looking up. Clarrisa pulled out a chair across from her and sat. "He tried to silence me again, pretended I wasn't even there." Miss Evelyn's hands paused. "Sometimes silence ain't just empty, baby. Sometimes it's a wall. But walls crack." Clarissa's jaw tensed. "What if they don't?" Miss Evelyn smiled, tired but unyielding. "Then you get louder, or smarter, or both." They ate dinner together in quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't punish you for existing. And when Clarrisa went to her room, she stood at the mirror and looked at herself, not just her reflection. Her voice had always been there, right in her chest, like a second heart, beating with purpose, beating with memory, beating with fire. The next morning, school hallways felt narrower, like they'd heard what she said yesterday and were still deciding how to feel about it. Eyes followed her, but not in the way she liked. She'd become a symbol before she'd been given a chance to be human. She passed a bulletin board plastered with flyers, drama club auditions, homecoming committee sign-up, debate team tryouts. That last one made her pause. The white sheet fluttered at the edge from someone's careless stapling job. The words, "Speak your mind, shape the world," were printed in bold at the top. Clarrisa stared at them for a moment, then pulled out her pen and signed her name. Not in cursive, not neatly, just big and sure, like she always was. The tryouts were that afternoon. When she walked into the room, Mr. Keene, the advisor and coach, looked up from his clipboard. "Clarrisa Dupri?" She nodded. "That's me." He flipped a page. "You signed up kind of late." "I tend to show up exactly when I'm supposed to," she said, and sat down. 5 students went before her. Some were stiff and nervous, reading from note cards like the words might melt in their hands. Some were decent. One boy, tall, blonde, blazer and all, was great, polished, confident. The kind of confidence that got handed to you in the hospital nursery. When it was Clarissa's turn, she stood up without a script. She didn't believe in rehearsing something she lived. "I wasn't told what the topic was," she began, "so I'm picking my own." Mr. Keene raised an eyebrow. "That's bold." Clarrisa shrugged. "So am I." She cleared her throat, took one breath, and her voice rolled out, steady and rich. "Every school has its silences. Ours hum louder than most. We silence people when we refuse to call on them. We silence them when we paint over their words on walls. We silence them when we pretend a raised hand is a threat. But let me ask you something. Who decides what volume is acceptable when you are trying to survive? If you shout for help, are you loud or are you alive?" She didn't look at anyone as she spoke, but she felt the room shift, heard the scratch of a pen. The boy in the blazer folded his arms and leaned back like someone just cut him in line. "My name is Clarrisa Dupri," she said, voice lifting at the end. "And I don't whisper through injustice. I speak. Loud enough to break something if I have to." She sat down. The room didn't clap. They just stared. And somehow, that silence felt less like absence and more like awe. Later that day, back at her locker, a post-it note was stuck to the front. It read, "You were amazing in there. Never dim that. Z." She didn't know who Z was, but for the first time in days, her chest didn't feel like it was holding in lightning. She folded the note carefully, slid it into her pocket, and walked down the hall. They hadn't given her permission. They hadn't crowned her. They hadn't even said her name. But they were listening now, and she was just getting started. The day the video went viral, Clarrisa didn't even know she'd been recorded. It started like any other Thursday. Loud hallways, indifferent teachers, the usual flinches when she spoke too clearly or too fast. She was walking past the stairwell by the gym when she heard shouting. It wasn't the usual roughhousing or drama over group chats. This was sharp. Then she saw it. Zane Holloway, quiet, short, pale, a junior who wore oversized hoodies even in May. He was pressed up against the lockers, his books scattered across the floor like someone had kicked them out of his hands. "Say it again," one of the boys said, laughing. "Go ahead, say it with your chest, nerd." Zane didn't respond. His hands were shaking. His eyes darted toward the hallway, looking for an exit that wasn't there. Clarrisa didn't hesitate. She walked up like the hallway belonged to her, like the floor would move for her footsteps if it had sense. One of the boys noticed her and rolled his eyes. "Oh look, here comes the Civil Rights Podcast." "Move," she said. The boys snorted. "Why, you filming a TED Talk today or something?" "I said," she repeated, stepping closer. "Move." The tension dropped like a storm cloud. Other students started slowing down, phones out, watching, recording, waiting for someone to swing or back down. "You always gotta make everything a protest," the taller boy muttered. "Y'all always gotta make everything a threat," she fired back. "But you know what's funny? The real threat is a girl who refuses to shut up." The boys grumbled and backed off, tossing one last insult under their breath before disappearing into the crowd. She didn't chase after them. She turned to Zane. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded. "Barely. I didn't say anything. I just told them the Holocaust wasn't overhyped." Clarrisa blinked. "What?" He shrugged. "They said it was a narrative, that it's not the same as slavery, so it gets too much airtime. I told them both mattered. They didn't like that." Clarrisa clenched her jaw. This school's allergic to nuance. She helped him pick up his books. People kept filming. One girl mouthed, "You're going viral," like it was a compliment. Clarrisa didn't care. She wasn't doing it for a spotlight. But the spotlight came anyway. By third period, the clip was all over Instagram and TikTok. Clarrisa standing in front of Zane like a human shield, voice clear, tone unshakable. The caption, "When they try to bully the quiet kid, but the black girl said not today. Speak up? Ashwood High." 24 hours later, it had 2.3 million views. And Clarrisa Dupri had a platform she never asked for. News outlets started calling the school. First the local ones, then national ones. One reporter wanted to fly out to interview her and Zayn together. Another offered a segment called Voices of Gen Z. Students began whispering, "That's her," in hallways. Teachers started addressing her more carefully. Mr. Briggs, for the first time all semester, called on her without hesitation. She answered with a calm that made his pen tremble slightly as he took notes. By Friday, Principal Saunders called her into the office. Clarrisa thought it was going to be the usual polite warning, "Stay humble, don't let it get to your head, we still have rules here, blah, blah, blah." But this had wit. But this time, Saunders looked proud. Not entirely, but enough. "You've made quite the name for yourself," she said. Clarrisa folded her arms. "It's not about the name." Saunders nodded slowly. "I know. That's why it's working." There was a pause. Then she added, "We've had inquiries, media outlets, even an organization that runs a national youth summit for civic leadership. They want to fly you out to D.C. next month. Keynote speaker slot, all expenses paid." Clarrisa blinked. "What?" "They saw the clip," Saunders said, handing her a letter. "They saw you." Clarrisa took it with shaking hands. It had a gold emblem at the top, the kind that felt official even before you read a single word. "They want me to speak?" "Yes," Saunders said, "and I think you should." That night at home, Clarrisa sat with the letter on her lap while Miss Evelyn stirred gumbo in the kitchen. "You gonna read it aloud or just stare at it like it owes you money?" Evelyn asked. Clarrisa read the letter. By the end, her voice was trembling. Miss Evelyn turned down the stove and walked over. She didn't say much, just wrapped her arms around her granddaughter and let the pride radiate through the silence. "You remember what I always told you?" she whispered. Clarrisa nodded, eyes wet. "Say it." Clarrisa breathed deep. "Don't ever let them shame me for my voice." "Mm-hmm. And what else?" "It's where my ancestors lived." Miss Evelyn kissed her forehead. "Now, go take them with you, wherever this leads." The next few days blurred into planning and media interviews and careful outfits. She practiced her speech in the mirror, in the living room, even to the family cat, who didn't care either way. And then came the summit. The moment she stepped onto that D.C. stage, lights beaming, hundreds of teens watching, Clarrisa remembered every time a teacher had ignored her, every time someone said she was too much, every time her voice had been met with silence, or worse, laughter. She took the podium, paused, and smiled. "Good evening," she said, voice crisp as glass. "I'm Clarrisa Dupri, and they used to call me Too Loud." The crowd leaned in. She looked out over the sea of faces and thought, "Y'all have no idea what's coming next." And they didn't. Not yet. But they were listening now. 2 weeks after the summit, Clarrisa was back at Ashwood High, walking through the same old hallways, but they didn't feel the same. Something had shifted. The lockers were still dented, the announcements still crackled over busted intercoms. But people looked at her differently now. Not with fear, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. Respect. She passed Mr. Briggs on the way to English. He gave her a tight nod, the kind of nod that said more than words. He didn't say, "Good job." He didn't have to. The man who once ignored her hand in the air now held the door open when she walked in. When she sat down, Kayla leaned over and whispered, "So, when are you running for president?" Clarrisa rolled her eyes with a grin. "Girl, I'm still trying to pass calc." "Whatever. You're going to be running this country in 10 years. Just don't forget me when you're in the White House." At the end of class, Mr. Briggs did something he'd never done before. He stopped her on the way out, not to scold, not to warn, but to offer a quiet sentence she wouldn't forget. "You turned your volume into vision," he said. Not many people know how to do that. Clarrisa didn't respond right away. Then, cool as ever, she replied, "I was never the problem, just the proof." That afternoon, when she got home, Evelyn was already in the kitchen, blues playing low, cornbread in the oven. On the table sat a large envelope with a government seal on it. "Another award?" Clarrisa teased as she set down her bag. Evelyn didn't answer right away, just looked at her, eyes glittering. "It's not an award." Clarrisa opened the envelope and pulled out the letter. She read the first line, blinked twice, then read it again. It was from the campaign office of Senator Rebecca Caldwell. They wanted Clarrisa. Not for a scholarship, not for a photo op, not to be a mascot for progress. They wanted her to join the campaign team as a youth communications advisor, the youngest in the history of any presidential campaign. "They saw your speech," Evelyn said. "The senator's team said they watched it 10 times. Clarrisa sat down, the letter still in her hands. "Me? In D.C.? In politics?" Evelyn shrugged like it was obvious. "Why not? You've already been doing the work. They just want to give you a mic." Clarrisa reread the letter. It felt surreal. But it also felt right. A week later, she was back in D.C., this time not to speak, but to build. She spent days with other advisors, most of them at least a decade older, all of them stunned by how naturally she took control of a room. Her job wasn't just to write, it was to listen. To the way young people spoke, what they feared, what they dreamed of. Her words started shaping policy drafts, rally scripts, debate prep. Senator Caldwell met her in person after the 3rd week. "You're not here because of a viral video," she told Clarrisa. "You're here because your voice reaches people we stopped hearing." Clarrisa smiled. "I was just saying what I needed to hear growing up." "Exactly," the senator said. "That's why it matters." The night before the first big rally, Clarrisa stood backstage with a tablet in hand. She had helped craft the opening lines, words that would be broadcast on every major news network. She looked down at the draft and saw her phrasing, her rhythm, her truth. "I want to speak to those who've been told their voice is too loud," the speech began. "Because loud voices carry across silence, and sometimes it's the silence that needs breaking." Standing there in that moment, Clarrisa didn't feel 17. She felt timeless. She felt ready. Months passed. The campaign picked up speed. Clarrisa began appearing on panels, writing op-eds, mentoring youth leaders who messaged her from across the country. From Detroit to Dallas, students were quoting her lines, echoing her courage. Back at Ashwood High, they painted a new mural. This time, no one erased it. At the bottom, in bold colors and jagged brushstrokes, someone had written, "Speak truth, even when it shakes the room. Clarrisa Dupri." She saw a photo of it on her feed one morning while eating breakfast at the campaign office. Someone had tagged her. "Our school used to silence us. Now it echoes her." She sat back and let that sink in. The girl who was too loud in class. The girl who was sent out for being disruptive. The girl who defended one quiet kid in a hallway. Now advised the voice of a future president. One night, back in her D.C. apartment, Evelyn called her just to talk. "You know what I was thinking about?" her grandmother asked. "What's that?" "The time you came home in 2nd grade, mad as the devil because your teacher told you to lower your tone. You cried so hard I thought you'd crack." "I remember," Clarrisa said. "You told me my voice was a torch. And baby, now look, you're lighting up the country with it." Clarrisa closed her eyes, smiling into the dark. Not long after, the campaign released a commercial. Just 60 seconds. No fancy graphics. Just footage of Clarrisa's speech at the youth summit. Her voice crisp, eyes blazing, shoulders strong. The ad ended with the words, "We don't need permission to speak, we just need courage. The future is listening." Her name trended again. But this time, it wasn't a moment. It was a movement. Clarrisa didn't need to be the loudest in the room anymore, because now the world was amplifying her. And somewhere in a classroom, another black girl was raising her hand. Proud, unapologetic. Because of Clarrisa Dupri, the girl they tried to silence, who became the voice of a nation. Let me know when you're ready for your hook, summary, and thumbnail concept, and I'll package it all up for maximum YouTube impact. He said, why was she the voice of the nation? ChatGPT said, Clarrisa Dupri became the voice of the nation, not because she wanted the spotlight, but because her voice refused to be silenced when others needed it most. She stood up when no one else would. In a hallway where bullying went ignored, she shielded a quiet, targeted classmate, and without knowing it, gave voice to the voiceless. Her words weren't just powerful. They were personal. They spoke to generations of people, especially young black girls who'd been told they were too loud, too bold, or too much. And when her voice echoed beyond that school, into millions of homes, across news outlets, and onto national stages, people listened. Because she didn't speak for power, she spoke for truth. Her tone carried strength, vulnerability, and the fire of every ancestor who'd ever been told to lower their voice just to survive. In a country tired of empty promises and polished speeches, Clarrisa's raw honesty and fearless defiance mattered. She didn't speak for the nation. She reminded the nation how to listen, and in doing so, she became the voice it couldn't afford to ignore. Would you like me to now create the dynamic hook, summary, thumbnail concept, and thumbnail text to wrap this story for you two? He said, did she perform a speech? ChatGPT said, yes, absolutely. Clarrisa performed multiple speeches throughout her journey, but the most pivotal one, the one that turned her into the voice of a nation, was at the National Youth Summit in Washington, D.C. That moment was the turning point. She stood on stage in front of hundreds of students and leaders from around the country after being invited because of the viral video where she defended a bullied student. But this wasn't just a speech about that moment, it was a declaration. She opened by saying, I'm Clarrisa Dupri, and they used to call me too loud. From there, she spoke without a script, from her soul. She spoke for the kids told to sit down and be quiet, for the students erased from classrooms, for every person whose identity was treated like a disruption. Her speech wasn't just words, it was a reckoning. It hit social media like lightning. News outlets replayed it, teachers started showing it in class, political leaders quoted her. That speech didn't just inspire, it created change. And that's what led to Senator Rebecca Caldwell offering Clarrisa a place on her presidential campaign team. So yes, Clarrisa delivered a speech. But more than that, she delivered a message. And the nation heard her. Would you like me to write out that full Youth Summit speech as a bonus scene or side clip for the video?